All right, everybody. This is Russell Christian from the Case for Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. We're here today with another guest on the podcast, Graig Kreindler. Greg is that I said that right?
Yeah,
Say it
you
right.
got it right.
Perfect. Um, Greg is a very excellent painter. If you go online, you can see his paintings. He paints beautiful paintings of baseball. I love watching these paintings, just looking at them. I kind of lose myself in them. So, Greg, is it Greg or Greg? Am I saying?
Greg is fine. I mean, it's kind of spelled Greg, but yeah, I think it's usually Greg.
Greg. All right, Greg.
Yeah.
Perfect. Greg, his paintings are excellent. So he's here. He's taking the time to come talk with me. We're going to put this out as an episode. So, Greg, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Russell.
You're welcome. I wanted to ask you, just start off with some softball questions. I was looking at your paintings and they're beautiful. And for the record, we were talking a little bit off the record. I play music. You see the guitars behind me. I've had some musicians on the show. I don't paint. I can't draw a stick figure. So it's kind of fascinating for me. If some of my questions seem very basic and elementary, forgive me. And in some
No,
ways, it might be helpful to our listeners. A lot of people don't paint, so that's great that you have that knowledge. So
thank
uh,
you.
I wanted to ask, did you get into paint? What did you get into first? Did you get into painting or did you get into baseball first or kind of about the same time?
Well, so I got into art first. So I was drawing when when I was pretty young. I think you and I are around the same age. I just turned 45.
Yeah, I would say
Oh,
because
okay.
one of
So
79. So yeah.
Okay. So when I was growing up or when we were growing up, I guess, I was really into cartoons, like a lot of us. So like He-Man and Thundercats and G.I. Joe, stuff like that. And that was kind of the first stuff that I started to draw. And I for whatever reason, I don't know what drew me to it. It might have been the action. It might have just been, the cool characters, the guns, the weaponry, whatever. But yeah, I remember, that my dad used to kind of like tape the shows as they would air, and then I'd kind of like pop them in the VCR and just like press pause on a scene and then just like try to copy, diligently from the screen. Uh, so it started with that, but pretty soon after, I kind of, I got into baseball and I discovered my dad's baseball card collection, or what was left of his baseball card collection. And he grew up in New York City in the late 40s and early 50s, and he was a card collector. And like I think like most people his age, he has like the horror story of his mom throwing out the cards, while he's in college or not home or whatever. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but it happened. But he was able to keep a number of those old 40s and 50s cards. And as I'm like looking through them, I realized that you have these early Bowman and early Topps issues, and the majority of them were using paintings. They were using illustrations in as their artwork. They weren't using, it wasn't like based off of photography so much.
Okay.
So I think something in my head kind of clicked where I was like, oh, that's cool. I know my dad loves Mickey Mantle, so why don't I try drawing Mickey Mantle for him? And hoping like I'd get like the pat on the back, the good job, son. Uh, so I started doing that, and that's kind of how it all started. I got really into the players that he grew up watching. The Mickey Mantles and the Yogi Berras and the Whitey Fords. Uh, in addition to being into the Yankees at the time, like in the 80s, so like Mattingly, Winfield, Ricky Henderson, people like that. So yeah, that's where it started.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was just looking at the 52 and the 53 tops. I'm sure there's a few more in the air, but those two sets in particular. I mean, I don't have a lot of those cards. I've got a few of the 53s, in pretty poor condition. To get good condition, they're pricey, but the 53 especially for me is beautiful. Look at the Mickey. I've got a 53 Yogi. It's a
Oh,
beautiful
nice.
card. I want to say it's like a PSA 1 or 2. I mean, it's not. I
Yeah,
don't have a
whatever.
PSA 10, but yeah, it's just beautiful. The Jackie, the 53 tops Jackie. It's beautiful. It's people use the phrase "hanging in the Louvre" kind of a little too much nowadays. They're beautiful, absolutely beautiful paintings. That's really cool.
Yeah. And with the border, like either the red or the black border that you kind of get like on one of the corners. It's just, I mean, obviously that part is really condition sensitive if we're getting into that, lane, but the cards themselves are just so beautiful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sorry, I just realized I don't need my headphones. I could hear you in my speakers. Sorry, I thought that was pretty technical. Like I'm hearing an echo here.
That's all good.
Yeah, so you mentioned, so I had Chuck Brodsky on the podcast. I'm still editing the episode, put it out, and we had a good talk about baseball, how he got into baseball through his father. It sounds like you got into baseball through your father as well. That's
Yeah.
fair to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It was mainly through him, but what's interesting is that I'd mentioned my dad grew up, in New York City, mostly like Queens. My mother also grew up in New York City, first kind of starting her life out in Brooklyn and then also in Queens. And she was a big Brooklyn Dodgers fan. Uh,
cool.
so, like, my dad being a Yankees fan and my mom being a Dodgers fan, I have no idea how that worked out, but they've been happily married for, 50 plus years. Uh, but yeah, it's kind of like baseball was like always there, it was always part of the equation.
Yeah, and I don't, not to make it about myself. I mentioned this a lot on my podcast. I kind of got into baseball too. My parents were into baseball, so it's a great passing of the torch in terms of the generational aspect. Not to get into personal, but do you have kids yourself? And so have you gotten them into baseball?
I do. So I have two boys. They are 7 and 9. And they don't really care about baseball. They're not, it's interesting, they're not really around it that much because, so the work that I do it's very contained to kind of like my studio. And the studio is a room in our apartment, but I don't really keep up with current baseball all that much, so I'm never watching games. Like every now and again, I'll go to a game, like maybe once a year. Uh, so I just kind of feel like though they're growing up with it, they're not really being exposed to it, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. I was
Yeah,
gonna say there's also the sort of the element of like, well, this is what dad does for a living, and dad's never cool in the eyes of kid. We're talking Jerry Garcia with your shirt. It's like, and your dad is Jerry Garcia. You're like, "Hey,
right,
people are
right.
not cool." It's like, yeah, your dad's pretty cool. So,
Yeah,
um,
no, they want nothing to do with any of the stuff that I'm interested in.
yeah,
If I tried to sorry to talk about the dead for a second, but I remember putting on a song for my oldest. We were like in the car and he's in the back seat, and I put on one of the other ones from the Europe 72 tour, and he looks at the timing, that you can see on like the console, and he's like, "This song is 36 minutes?" I'm like, "You're not ready for it, kid."
you're not cool. It needs to be 2 minutes 30 seconds. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with Yeah, so there's that. Yeah, I didn't know if that was the issue too, where it's you're so well known with what you do and so good at what you do that all of a sudden that isn't cool. So there's like a backlash that sometimes of a kid. That's how kids are.
Yeah, no. I appreciate that, but no, I mean, I'm not cool, but it might be for other reasons. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of music, I was reading about your bio. You grew up in Rockland County, New York. Is that correct?
Yes.
I had some friends in college that were from Stony Point. In fact, the drummer in my
Oh,
first band, Pete Green, if you listen, I haven't talked to him in years, but listen out there, shout out to Pete. And he was from Stony Point. So I was like, I know Rockland County, that.
yeah. Yeah. I had a couple friends in Stony Point too.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah. So just north of New York City. Now, growing up, I'm assuming were you a Yankees fan or not?
Yeah, no, yeah, I was mainly a Yankees fan. I mean, definitely not definitely not a Mets household. Though I think the majority of my friends at the time were probably Mets fans, I think like fresh off of like 86 and all. But yeah, I grew up a Yankees fan, and that was kind of uh it was very much more, I guess, a part of who I was than it is now. Because now, I'm still a Yankees fan and I love the Yankees, but I feel like I'm just a fan of the whole globular world of baseball.
And I grew up in Atlanta. I'm a Braves fan, but my wife, much to her disdain, I have shirts and hats from a lot of different teams, and she's like, "I thought you were a Braves fan." I said, "Well, I just love the game, and especially with some of the City Connects and stuff. That some of them are bad, but like the Angel City Connect, that's a beautiful hat, and I got that hanging in the closet. So she's like,
I
"Oh, you're a
love
Braves
that
fan." I'm
one.
like, "Well, if it's a nice hat or a cool T-shirt, I'm gonna get it."
Yeah.
You see, like I've got a picture of Don Drysdale signed there. So,
Oh yeah.
once you get into baseball, there's the greater world of baseball. Yeah, we have our teams. Some people are very much, no, I don't wear anything but another team. I don't cheer for another team. I'm like, well, you're kind of limiting yourself a little bit. I had this conversation with some friends under the World Series last year. Like, Dodgers, Yankees, who wants to watch that? I'm like, yeah, who wants to watch the two best teams in baseball right now with Judge and Ohtani, the two best players? Like, who wants to watch that?
Yeah.
It was a incredible World Series, obviously. Probably wish
Yeah.
Yankee won, but is what it
Yeah. But
is.
no, it's weird because everybody takes the fandom differently, and
Sure, yeah.
like I just a weird like case in point, like when I was younger, not that much younger, but let's say like 10, 15 years ago, I did a painting of David Ortiz that
Cool.
was depicting his home run off of Paul Quantrill in the 2004 ALCS. Kind of like when everything changed for the Yankees. They lost four straight. Not a great day, but I remember like working on this. I was still living at home at the time, and my dad comes downstairs and he's like, "Man, why are you painting David Ortiz?" Being the Yankee fan. And I'm like, "Well, like you told me, sometimes, when you grow up, you got to do things that you don't want to do to make money."
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, those early 2000s Red Sox teams, that was a fun time in baseball history. And you can't ignore, I see you got Ted Williams painting down there. You can't ignore some of these great Red Sox players. It's funny, my brother called me a few weeks ago. He had tickets to the Dodgers Braves games in Atlanta this past,
Oh,
and he knows I love Ohtani, the same things, but when Ohtani got it, he hit a home run, and later in the game he got up and we were heckling him. Nothing bad, but hey, bad swing, Ohtani. I think I put a video on my Twitter. Hey, bad swing, Ohtani. He's like, "Isn't Ohtani your favorite player?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, but I play the Braves, so yeah, I can't cheer for him right now. I gotta heckle him, but they don't do
it's that.
nobodies. He's my
Yeah,
favorite
it's the
players."
I forget who says it. I can't attribute the quote to them, but it's something like, you root for the name on the front, not the name on the back or
Exactly,
whatever.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So cool, cool, cool. I want to get into your painting a little bit. We were just talking a little bit before we got on here, just in terms of watermarking, if you will, historically the date that we're talking. We heard the announcement there was a new pope, and when we get off and see who it was. My wife and I took a trip to Italy a few years ago. Of course, anyone's been to Italy, I went to the Vatican Museum, went to Florence, saw the paintings of all the masters, Raphael and Michelangelo. Are those the guys that inspired you, or did you have a different inspiration? I'm curious who your artistic inspirations were.
That's a great question, actually, because people, a lot of folks who ask me about that, I think they just kind of ask who the inspirations are, but the fact is, it's kind of like when you first kind of learn about art, or at least when we did, people our age did. I kind of feel like those Italian Renaissance masters are the people who you were learning about first. They never really did much for me. I mean, I appreciate them. I can look at Michelangelo and Da Vinci and appreciate it for what it is. And I think, that they were incredible artists, but I it's not the kind of artwork that I gravitate towards. I'm kind of all over the place and I'm inspired by a lot of different things, but I think what happened was when I went to school, to art school here in the city, I think I kind of really honed in on the kind of work uh, that tugs on my heartstrings, and the common through line, at least for representational work, the common through line was always like light and color. Like that was something that I kind of always responded to. If there was some sort of depiction of light and color that would create a mood in a painting, like that's what had me. So like some of the impressionists I like a lot. I like the Monets and the Renoirs and people like that. But I'm also very drawn to like the golden age of illustration. So people like Norman Rockwell and J.C. Leyendecker and Dean Cornwell and people who were kind of creating pictures that were telling stories, narrative paintings. Uh, but then, there's also like, John Singer Sargent and some of his contemporaries, and it just kind of it like runs the gamut. Um, but I think there's one artist who was actually one of my teachers at SVA at the art school, and I think ever since that class or the classes that I took with him, he's kind of become like one of my biggest sources of inspiration because he was the one who kind of taught me to kind of observe and appreciate light and color. Like it's his fault that I'm the way that I am. Um, and I love his work and I always look at it, and he's still he's a dear friend, which I'm very grateful for. And I can always talk to him about art and stuff like that. And he's been probably like the biggest influence out there. And he used to like the thing about the school that I went to is all of the teachers there, they're working professionals. So you're not getting like a person who's kind of like a professional teacher who doesn't necessarily do artwork in their spare time. Like they're not making a living off of their artwork. But at the School of Visual Arts, they are. So this teacher, like he was an illustrator for like a book cover and editorial illustrator for 30 years or so. And I think by the time I graduated in 2002, he kind of made the switch from that to just landscape painting, just like fine art landscape painting, gallery painter, stuff like that. And yeah, it's like everything he says, I just kind of like soak up like a sponge. Um, so his name is Peter Fiore.
That's great.
I don't know if he'll ever see this, but but yeah, he's something.
That's great. Yeah. Because and I'm not an art history expert. So if I say things and you're like, this guy's an idiot, I apologize. But I feel like we're talking about the Renaissance masters, and or I forget, there was one guy, is it Caravaggio? There was one guy that was really big in
Caravaggio.
side lighting. Did I say it right?
Yeah, Caravaggio.
Caravaggio, yeah. Yeah, was he an influence? Because I just remember that, a lot of his paintings would have light from the side or light from the top and everything like that. Is he an influence on you?
Yeah, he was a little bit. In terms of color, not as much because I kind of feel like he spent a lot of time in like the browns and black
Sure.
territories, but he was very big on employing this something this I don't know if it's so much a technique as it is kind of a way of thinking called chiaroscuro,
Okay.
which is basically I think it translates to light on dark,
Yeah.
uh, or light and dark. So chiaroscuro, like if someone is employing that or thinking of that or putting that into their piece, that kind of means that it's basically just a strong sense of light, like a strong sense of contrast. So in a lot of Caravaggio's paintings, you see that there are like beams of light, and figures are in like heavy shadow with little random parts of like their arm, like peeking into the light beam or whatever. uh, that sort of thinking was very influential on me from that sense, just from the light sense.
Very cool, very cool. And I was going to say another observation I had, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with the Renaissance masters, there was this emphasis on realism, and then in Europe, I feel like in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, you started getting Impressionism, and Picasso was doing Cubism. But I feel like in America here, realism was still going strong. You mentioned Norman Rockwell, and that's just when I first saw your paintings, I was thinking this is very Rockwell, and Grant Wood and Wyatt and some of these painters from America were still doing maybe not 100% photorealism, but to me, very realistic. Um, and it's very American in some ways, I think. And that kind of brings me to tie it all in. We're talking about art history here. I want to get into the baseball aspect of your paintings. Were you inspired not just by Rockwell, but some of these other American painters that were painting realistic styles? Um,
Yeah, yeah, in different ways. You know, obviously the Rockwells, like I had mentioned, uh, but also American artists like Chuck Close, even even people like Jackson Pollock, who's doing kind of abstract expressionistic work. It doesn't necessarily show its face so much in what I do, but I'm still kind of absorbing it and taking something from it. Even if it's just kind of a feeling and something that is kind of intangible that I can't really explain. But yeah, there were a lot of American artists. I mean, all those artists that you just mentioned, Wyeth and whatnot, like those also, they were very big guys. Uh, for me. And, I was very attracted to, like I mentioned, the golden age of illustration. The majority of that, uh, for the most part, it's American illustration. And the majority of those people, they were like kind of trained under a couple of people who were first trained by Howard Pyle, who's like the grandfather of illustration, and he's kind of responsible for teaching people kind of how to work in somewhat of a European way, but commercially. So he's teaching students about kind of how to stage a picture, how to create a narrative, and how to kind of imbue it with stuff that I think commercial work didn't necessarily have yet. So those artists that kind of stem from him, Rockwell being one of them, Wyeth was one of his students, Frank Schoonover, Dean Cornwell, those are all like his students. Uh, I very much find stuff in their work that really, really appeals to me.
Right. You use the phrase commercial work, and I wanted to ask you because when I first started, talking to my wife about doing this podcast, I said the great thing about baseball or sports is that you kind of have a built-in fan base. You're not making a podcast where I talk about, something random. You've got this automatic fan base. And I wanted to ask, is that something, did you set out intentionally say, I'm just gonna make paintings about baseball, or did you do one and someone bought it and go ahead, well, do it again? And, how did that work where you started getting into producing almost exclusively baseball paintings?
You know what? It all kind of happened together because when I did when I did kind of like my first quote unquote mature baseball painting, I was more so in love with the idea that I enjoyed the process, I enjoyed the process of researching, I enjoyed the painting process, I enjoyed thinking about it. Because it's like I got to think about baseball and baseball history, and what's more fun than that? Um, and I think I think when I was starting to kind of do some more baseball paintings, I was more so following the fact that I enjoyed them and that I was hoping that there might be a place for them uh, somewhere to, so that I could make a living or somewhat of a living off of them. But yeah, it wasn't until I was, I don't know, maybe a couple years into it that I realized that sure, people might like my work and they might think that what I do is special, but at the same time, I think the uh I think the content is driving that home more so than my abilities as an artist, which is I'm totally fine by that. Um, because yeah, it's like you have a built-in audience for baseball. Like if I was just painting portraiture of dignitaries or whatever, or if I was doing still lifes or landscape paintings, I think for the most part I would just be lost in the shuffle. And I would just be kind of like any other artist. But with the baseball stuff, I love it so much. I have such a passion for the sport and the sport's history and the desire to kind of create work that is based on that. Um, I think it's just like a perfect confluence that there are people interested in buying that stuff. So I'm grateful for that.
Sure, yeah, yeah, and you're being a little modest here because you still have to paint your good paintings, and your paintings are beautiful. I'm looking at your website here, so
No,
um,
I
I'm sure,
appreciate
yeah, I'm sure there are other people that paint, baseball paintings, but I'm looking at these and um, Yeah, they're beautiful. And I want to ask you, we're getting a lot of detail about art history and stuff. I want to veer into baseball, but you
Sure.
don't know a
Sorry.
lot about painting. I'm assuming these are oil paintings that your primary
Yes.
medium.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because they have a beauty to them. But one of the things that fascinates me is you paint a lot of paintings of 19th century players, pre-war players, and the vivid colors are just to me kind of a stark contrast to an era that is mainly remembered as in black and white. So I think to me, and I hope other people feel this way, you really make these players and eras come alive. And
Oh,
you know,
thank you.
yeah,
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, that's very much the goal because I I don't know if I don't know if you'd ever seen the shows that HBO had in the early 90s, the When It Was a Game
no, no, I didn't
series.
see that.
So When It Was a Game, there are three episodes of it,
Okay.
and what they are is it's basically home movie video footage compiled, usually taken by like the players, uh, from basically like the late 30s into the end of the 60s. And it's pretty much all in color.
Great.
And it's like actual color. It's not, it's not AI color or whatever. Uh, and the first time I saw that, we're talking like the early 90s, seeing seeing footage of Ebbets Field or Mickey Mantle like in color, like this is like that's not the Mickey Mantle I know. The Mickey Mantle I know is like in a book there and it's in a black and white photograph. But
Yeah,
no, this is real. This is what it was. This is like, if my dad is thinking about Mickey Mantle, he's thinking about that in color, like actually seeing it.
exactly.
And that I think that's what really appeals to me uh, so much about those earlier days of the sport because I feel like pre I don't know pre 1960. I think for the most part, when we think of those players, if we don't know about baseball cards, we're thinking about them in black and white.
Sure, yeah.
But being conscious of the fact that that Babe Ruth hit home runs in color, it's like I want to do everything I can to kind of, I guess, show people that that's the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Babe Ruth, and you talk about a player that is not only arguably the greatest player of all time, but the off the field stories, just a larger than life character, for good or for bad. He had his faults, and it's like that's not a player that you can just put in a drab black and white. Like
No.
it's larger than life. This guy did some wild stuff. You gotta have him in color. And I think of a lot of characters from, even Ty Cobb, for good or for bad, he was certainly a player that, is more than just a boring black and white, picture of grandpa. I think we just psychologically associate black and white pictures, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they had to sit still for the camera and
Right. It's just,
it was stern,
yeah.
smiling, and so it's like, wow, people were bored. And no, people were really excited back then. And I'm looking at your paintings here, the 19th century players with their mustaches and everything. And
Yeah.
you read some stories about those eras and the players, and it's like these guys were wild. Some of these guys. I was reading a book about 19th century baseball recently, and they're saying, half the guys were just hammered at the game. These guys were playing drunk and yelling at fans and smoking cigars in the dugout. I'm like, there was. I'm not trying to encourage behavior, but like, there's a lot of life going on. This wasn't just some drab black and white, grandpa's church league. Like these guys were wild. So to
Yeah.
add some color and some life to these characters, the old hosses I'm looking here, almost
Yeah. Yeah,
is
all those guys. It's
yeah,
think of how many of them, died before they were 50.
yeah, yeah,
Probably like all of them or 90% of them.
yeah. And I wanted to ask because I see you had a painting of Rube Waddell, who's someone I've mentioned on the podcast, one of the weirder characters in baseball history. I've mentioned before a guy, Huey Jennings. I don't know if you've done any paintings. Have you done any Huey Jennings paintings? Yeah.
Not yet, but he's on my very long list.
Yeah, he's a favorite of the podcast, the fans of the podcast, because when I did my Chase Utley episode, I was reading about Chase Utley's one of the few players that has over 200 hit by pitches, and I said, well, who's the all-time leader in hit by pitches? And it's Huey Jennings. And when you read about him, he was apparently on the field just a giant. I mean, there's a reason why he got thrown at a lot. And you're like, this guy needs a vivid color painting. He can't just put a little black and white photo of him. So.
Oh yeah, but when you see him, you see photos of him kind of like on the sideline, doing the kick or whatever,
Yeah,
and you look at him and he looks like a maniac. And
yeah,
like that's somebody who it's like he obviously has a very interesting face and a very interesting story. And yeah, he's someone who I really want to paint.
for sure, for sure. I want to ask you, you used the word earlier about detail, attention to detail. And
Yeah.
I'm looking at a lot of your paintings, and some of the paintings, especially the ones where there's a scene in a ballpark.
Mm.
Um, do you put in the research to make sure the box score is correct, the ads are correct? It looks like you do your research. Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, I do. I mean, so for the most part, nowadays, the majority of the work that I do is based kind of like solely on photography.
That,
And I'm not necessarily making much up. So a lot of the times the information is actually in the photography,
that
uh,
helps.
just when it comes to say, the scores or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I'll do research on, what if it's a particular game, if I can narrow it down, I'll like figure out, what the weather was like that day. I'll try to figure out what the proper colors of the ballparks were that particular day, the advertisements in the outfield or whatever. Like the historical accuracy part about it is super super important to me. uh I think stemming from the fact that I know that baseball fans in general are pretty anal about their history,
Yeah,
uh, which is awesome.
good,
uh
yeah.
and I kind of I think I do it partially because, there's a lot of OCD in there for sure, but also I don't want to be called out on like doing something wrong.
Sure, sure.
So there's always like the fear that I'm depicting something wrong. Uh, Especially like if I have to make kind of an educated guess on something. Like let's say I go back into the 20s and I'm looking at an advertisement and I just can't figure out what colors this thing should be. I'm going to make a best guess. And it's kind of like whether I'm right or wrong, probably no one's going to call me out on it. But in my head, there's still like a paranoia that, someday some like 150-year-old man is going to email me and be like, Mr. Kreindler, I was there that day and you did not do that correctly. So you're horrible and you should give up. So,
You touch upon something that's fascinating about baseball. I saw a stat the other day that Justin Verlander has pitched to 20% of all players that have played in MLB. And when you look at, I'm sure there's a fancy historical term for this, but when you look at sort of the collective memory, our lives, our generation, like your parents grew up in the 40s, 50s, and then their parent, baseball, at least modern baseball, 1903 was first World Series on, pretty much encapsulates three generations to the point where there are people alive today that maybe their parents, their lives and their knowledge, institutional collective memory spans the entire breadth of baseball. So yeah, there are people who, even if it's an old game in the 30s, say, hey, my grandpa was at that game and he told me this, this, and this. So it's not like you're painting scenes from 500 years ago. I mean, even though some of these incidents, some of these, I say incidents like that, but some of the moments that you're painting, a famous home run or something, there's a good chance people might even be alive or their parents or grandparents were alive. So yeah, you're not to put too much pressure on you to be
no,
accurate, but yeah, you're right.
don't
Baseball fan.
worry. I put that pressure on myself anyway. But yeah, there's in I think in Ken Burns's documentary, at some point, I think Daniel Okrent makes this comment about how uh how baseball kind of relates to generations like that, in that, a 300 hitter means something to me that, and it also means, the same thing to like someone who was watching baseball in the 1930s, and the same as it might have meant to like my great 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 grandfather who was watching baseball in like the 1880s. It's like that's like a markation that means something. And the fact that the game for the most part has stayed, basically the same for 100 and I guess over 125 years at this point is pretty remarkable.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. Um, I want to talk about a couple of the players. I'm looking at your website here. I want to talk about a few of the players you've painted that have come up before on this podcast. One of them, you've got a great painting of Dick Allen called Indefinitely Irreverent.
Ah,
Where did that title come from? I like that.
oh, well, thank you. Honestly, um, I'm not sure I remember where it came from. So a lot of these titles, I try to treat them kind of like newspaper titles, like in the way that a journalist would title an article that they wrote about that player at that time. And sometimes they get a little like, I don't know, uh, like they're like a play on words, or sometimes like they get a little like fine arty. And sometimes I forget what the reason was for making that title, and unfortunately, that's one of them.
No worries. I
But
want
yeah, I'm sure it has something like the irreverent. Obviously, probably has something to do with Alan's personality, kind of in general, and how he was perceived by the fans. But
Sure, sure. And I
yeah,
mentioned I had Chuck Brodsky, a songwriter, on as a guest, and he has a beautiful song about Dick Allen, Letters in the Dirt. And we talked a little bit about Dick Allen. Of course, I gotta mention Dick Allen because I did an episode about him, and he was voted into the Hall of Fame, and finally will get a Hall of Fame this year. But uh, I'm interpreting your title there, Irreverent, because he dealt with a lot of abuse, a lot of racial abuse, a lot of horrible stuff, and dealt with it in his own way. And that's kind of what the song "Letters in the Dirt" was about. Was he would write in the dirt, boo, and Chuck said that there was one he write October 1st, which is the end of the season. You get traded, stuff like that. So he wouldn't directly, interact with the fans and stuff, but he would kind of taunt them a little bit, and he had a little bit of a bravado about it. Like, oh, I'm not Jackie Robinson. I'm not gonna zip my mouth. I'm not gonna just sit here and take it. I'm
yeah,
gonna talk back, and I want to get out of here. So, he's an interesting character, and not to get off too much on Dick Allen, I would say, man, he did as well as he played in his career. I can't imagine how much better he might have done if he didn't have a hometown crowd that kind of hated him, for years in Philadelphia.
yeah. I mean, that's the problem, and
Yeah.
when you have that happen, when you have problems with the media or whatever, how you're perceived, it's going to affect things. And especially with him, with the Hall of Fame thing, it's like, do I think he's a Hall of Famer? Yeah, I very much do. But I also think that he should have gotten in while he was still alive. Same with like Minnie Minoso. It's like these people, I don't know. I mean, Minnie Minoso, I guess, is different because he doesn't necessarily have that same kind of relationship with like the media. But um I think that in a lot of cases, like like Kurt Schilling, like he's very much a lightning rod for that sort of thing, where it's hard to separate the kind of person that he is perceived as from his baseball abilities.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
and
it's interesting.
we could get off on a whole separate conversation about Schilling. I know he's come up before on the pod. I feel like either Chuck or Dan when I had him on we talked about him. I've said before, to me, there's no doubt based on his stats, his postseason accolades. He's certainly a Hall of Famer, but he didn't do himself any favors. I get that he's outspoken and all that stuff, so that you're going to lose some votes. But his last year on the baseball writers ballot, he literally said, "Don't vote for me. I'll take my chances with the Veterans Committee," and they were like, "Fine." It's like and I don't get off on it, but you can't really complain, Kurt. You literally told the voters don't vote for you, and they didn't. I think he's going to get in eventually. I don't think there's any doubt on his numbers, but yeah, he's not doing himself any favors. Um, that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, no, but you're right. I mean, it's there. Jeff Pearlman, the writer, talks about like David Ortiz getting in to the Hall of Fame, like that opens the floodgates because it's like here he is, somebody who I guess is, was caught, taking performance enhancing drugs, and they let him in.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do that, then you got to let Schilling in, you got to let in Bonds, you got to let in Clemens, you got to, I, but
Yeah.
it's like David Ortiz did that, but he had a great career and was also like an absolute media darling. So it's so weird. The Hall of Fame thing in general is just so weird. It makes no sense.
Yeah. In the PED issue, I've talked about it on the podcast before. It's like, in some ways, I'm kind of tired of talking about it. And my default position is, well, I still like those players and I still cheer for them.
Yeah.
Especially the players we grew up with, the Cansecos and McGuires,
Yeah.
and I'm like, you know
Yeah.
what? I still have the baseball cards. I like watching the highlights. It is what it is, and most of those guys aren't in the Hall. But yeah, it is interesting. Because not to get off on David Ortiz, my understanding is I guess his name was in the Mitch report and all this sort of stuff. But yeah,
Yeah.
he's a great spokesman for the game. He's an ambassador for the game. Everybody loves Big Poppy, and I've seen some comments. I think from some of the players themselves, some of the PED guys are like, yeah, "How's he in?" It's like, well, he's got a. In some ways, it just shows you in life. There's a lot that being a friendly person and having a friendly personality goes a long way sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. But that, that's not to say that, it's not to say that you are a bad person if you're not nice or something, if that makes sense.
It's it's sort of the every era has its own little controversies and little side stories, and that's kind of the controversy and side story of the 80s, 90s, early
Yeah.
2000s. And I guess I'll ask you to kind of bring back, does that come out in your paintings? Have you painted some of those, steroid era guys? And have you tried to get into that sort of discussion through your art?
Not many. I mean, I want to, like, Bonds especially. Like I've been wanting to paint Bonds for many years. I just haven't had the chance to do it. Uh, but I what I really like to do or try to do is just kind of present all of these players kind of honestly,
Yeah,
and factually. Like whatever my personal opinion is about them, I don't necessarily want that to come through. Uh, because, like you said, it's like you have people in the Hall of Fame who were like known racists, people who were supposedly in the KKK. I mean, like people sometimes would give me crap about painting Cobb. They're
sure.
like, "Oh, Cobb's this terrible racist and this and that," and I'm like, well, we know that that's not necessarily super true. That was kind of exaggerated from, Al Stump and yada
Yeah,
yada. But either way, whatever he did, it's kind of like he's still part of baseball. And I
yeah,
still just want to paint him and kind of present him, and everyone should just bring their own stuff into it. It's like I keep out of that part. My goal
yeah.
is to just, portray him honestly.
Yeah, the players, none of them are perfect, but they're part of the legacy of baseball, and it's Ty Cobb stats. You can't ignore them, and that's another whole separate conversation. The book about him was kind of a hit piece, and if I remember the story, was he wanted Ty to be involved, and Ty said no, and the author said, "Well, fine, I'm just going to throw you under the bus."
Yeah,
I'm sure he
something.
had his imperfections, but they were certainly exaggerated, as you said. Um, but you can't ignore the fact, his batting average and everything he did, the over 4,000 hits, he's certainly part of the game. And Babe Ruth
Yeah,
wasn't perfect either. The guy was
no, yeah,
a philanderer, womanizer, and call it, he's whatever you want to phrase you want to use. I mean, he was pretty much all of that, but also had a heart of gold and did things and donate, was spent time with the orphans, and he was a complex character. And that's what makes this interesting is too, is if you were to pick out one or two, well, this player did or said that, therefore you shouldn't talk about him, you shouldn't paint about. Well, you're not getting the whole picture of the complexity of a player, and I think the artwork helps with that. The fact that you're painting and looking at some of the paintings, and the a facial expression or something of a player that indicates there's something going on beneath the surface here, I think helps. So
well, thank you. I mean, a lot of that, I think a lot of that is due certainly to the photographers. I mean, they deserve all the credit for, I mean, capturing these players initially in that way. But at the same time, I think that baseball fans kind of take their knowledge of these players and that kind of colors how they see them. So like, I did one of the paintings in there of a 19th century guy named Marty Bergen. Uh, and he played for the Boston Beaneaters in the 1890s, and he was a great defensive catcher. Uh, what he's best known for, this is going to sound awful, but it's the truth. He's best known for actually kind of being uh, probably a schizophrenic and murdering his wife and his two children and then murdering himself.
Jeez.
And
I,
yeah, and it's like people are like, why would you paint this guy? And I'm like, well, it's part of baseball. And it's like, if you look at the image of him, and it's not necessarily through what I did, but I think what the photographer captured, you like look at him and you're like, wow, there's something like something's going on there.
sure. Looking at the painting right now, yeah, it's just something. Now that you say
Yeah.
that, I'm like, little
Yeah.
flashback. Um,
But I love that. I mean, I don't love people getting murdered, but I love the complex characters in the game. I mean, there's I George, I don't know why this is coming to mind, but George R. R. Martin, the writer, he talks about writing his characters and people kind of praise him for making them so nuanced and so gray. And and he said, well, that's the kind of stuff that I like to write. And, if I'm just writing a person that's just good and then a person that's just bad, it's like they're cardboard, there's nothing special about that. And I think every baseball player is like that. Every baseball player is gray, just like every human is gray. We all have a little good and a little evil in us. So yeah, it's important to kind of, I guess, put that out there.
sure. And as a history buff, that's how it is in history. Look at some characters in history, and there's very few people that are pure evil or pure good. It's like you have a lot of complex individuals. Um, and it's interesting. I think it was Edgar Allan Poe used to call it the fascination with the abomination or something like that.
Right,
These stories throughout history. You look like in America here, the Wild West. Who do we remember from the Wild West? The outlaws, the gunslingers. How many songs are there about Billy the Kid? It's like, didn't he murder 25 people
right,
if the numbers are correct? But that's
right.
who we remember just because it's an interesting story to the point where, 100, 150 years, however many years later, nobody's, I don't think there's very few people that are offended by a picture or painting of Billy the Kid. In fact, oh yeah, Billy the Kid or
Billy the
Jesse
Kid.
James or something, the
Yeah,
Outlaws. It's like, why are we idolizing the Outlaws? Because it was an interesting story. I forget the background story of Billy the Kid, but his benefactor, was murdered, I think, and then the Lincoln County cattle wars, and so the
right.
origin story of the outlaw is fascinating. And Jesse James, I think him and his brothers fought in the Civil War and then lost, and part of it was the Quattro's Raiders or something like that. So
Yeah.
there's these just interesting historical backstories. You know, if you slam the book on every character in history, you wouldn't learn anything. So
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
anyway,
Exactly. And that's kind of why partially why I feel like they all kind of deserve to be represented in some way.
sure,
Uh, yes, I love painting Mickey Mantle and I love painting Babe Ruth and Ted Williams and Jackie Robinson, but hey, I want to paint the Negro and Latin American League players that
definitely.
are basically forgotten today, or the girls in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, or whomever. They're all part of the story, the
Yeah,
great
and you just
story.
brought up something I wanted to make sure we got in. Especially here as with baseball statistic nerds in the past few years, the Negro League statistics have been determined to be Major League statistics, which has been fascinating, exciting. We're looking at new, I was mentioned on my Twitter the other day, I think it was Mule Suttles as the fourth highest slugging percentage of all time. Don't quote me on that, I don't have the stats in front of me, but some of these characters, it's interesting because we remember Satchel and Josh Gibson and Papa Bell, those kind of, I feel like the three main, most popular, well remembered, but there are
Very,
so many other players in the Negro Leagues. And unfortunately, the records for the Negro Leagues weren't kept as well. And to my point earlier about making players come alive, I mean, you've got some great paintings of some of the pre-war players and Negro League players. And I'm like, this is so exciting because I feel like there's a groundswell right now, especially with the announcement a few years ago of the stats being incorporated, the availability of the stats on Baseball Reference, the internet. So like now it's just a great time for historical research into the Negro Leagues. Tell us about that because you've got some great paintings, and again, you're making the players come alive. All these players that we remember in black and white.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I love painting them. I love painting those guys, and in some cases, I love painting those girls because there are a few of them.
Sure.
But yeah, it's a bit more of a challenge to paint those men and women because the black leagues were not covered in the same way that the white leagues were, where you have, let's say you're in uh, New York or whatever, you have a gajillion different newspapers there, all, covering a game and, with photographers there taking photos of the game for daily, sometimes multiple times a day, newspapers. And with like the black papers, some of those papers came out once a week, and you didn't necessarily have photographers going and taking a lot of photos of these players. Uh, so just finding the stuff to kind of work off of the photography, finding information, finding uh even like little tidbits about stuff visually, ballparks or uniform colors or whatever. It's just so much harder. To this day, it's like I still struggle. Like every time I paint one of those players, it's always like I'm pulling teeth trying to kind of be at peace with whatever decision I make, like color choice wise or whatever, because I want it to be accurate again, and it's like I don't know if anyone's going to be able to call me out on it, but uh, it comes back to kind of presenting those players honestly and making sure that they're not forgotten and that they're not swept under the rug, that they're an important part of the game and they're an important part of the country. uh,
Absolutely.
so that, yeah, that like in the past, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years, that has become super, super important to me. And trying to paint those men and women kind of like even in my spare time, because I don't necessarily get a lot of commissions for Negro Leaguers other than, your Satchel Paige and Josh Gibsons and whatever of the world. So I'm always trying to like dig into some of the lesser known guys and find images of them and try to bring those back to life. Uh,
Yeah.
it's hard, but I love it. So,
Yeah, it's great work. And the Hall of Fame is just really kind of scratching the surface of the great players.
oh
And
yeah.
sadly, we lost Buck O'Neill a few years ago, but, he was a great source of information on the Negro Leagues. And when I was doing some research for my episodes about the Veterans Committee, I was looking into Vic Harris and John Donaldson. And it's like, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name, but there's a guy who's basically spent his life researching John Donaldson and has a website about him. And it's like, the more you read, you're like, how is this guy not only not in the Hall of Fame, but not mentioned in the same breath as some of the greats?
Yeah, it's Pete Gorton.
Yeah, yeah. And Donald, everything that Satchel Paige is known for, he basically took from Donaldson, the whole like everybody sit down while I strike this guy out and so the taunting. And I guess the knock, so to speak, on Donaldson is that when his stats, he was barnstorming against whoever would play him in some small town. And I mentioned on my podcast, I said, well, he actually predates the Negro Leagues. That's the only way that he could play. And
Yeah.
his stats, I said, is like something like 400 wins and 4,000 strikeouts and all this stuff. And yeah, some of those were against whatever farmers were at the town he pulled up to, but it's not his fault. And then again, kind of like with Dick Allen and a lot of the players, the racism he experienced when he's barnstorming, especially playing from the South and stuff. It's like just awful, awful things he had to go through. It's like, how is this guy not in the Hall of Fame? And I think a lot of it is not that people aren't interested to hear the story. I think a lot of people just don't know that. And I've been a baseball nerd most of my life, and I'm like, I don't know a lot about this guy, and I didn't know a lot about Vic Harris. And so just getting them on the ballot got a lot of people like myself and yourself that to read about them. So I'm saying all this to thank you and applaud you for the work. You know, these are
Oh,
these are players that need to be memorialized. And again, not just in 1930s black and white photograph, but in the vivid color of the times. That we want to remember these exciting characters are. Again, stories of John Donaldson, Satchel Paige. Everybody sit down. Can you imagine that if it happened nowadays in a game?
oh
You
my
see a clip on ESPN. Oh, the pitcher told everyone to sit down as he struck out this player. I'm like, those are great stories. That's not
yeah.
something that should be just a boring footnote in a history book. I'm like, these stories need to come alive. So
Yeah, but that's a very important thing what you mentioned. I mean, I didn't even necessarily think of it in those terms, but you're right because yes, Donaldson spent the majority of his career, or not the majority, but a lot of his career in the pre like national, the Negro National League. So he's playing all these barnstorming games and he's playing against not necessarily top talent. But hey, guess what? That's our fault. Like it's like we did that to him. It's oh god.
So to say he can't get in the Hall of Fame, so well that he wasn't playing as major league player, he wasn't allowed to play
He
in the
wasn't allowed to. Yeah. It's
and
like
there wasn't even the Negro National League. I think it was Rube Foster. If I remember, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, 1920-ish. Don't quote me. Someone's going to jump all over me. I think that was around when he created. So
no,
um,
you're right. You're right on.
yeah, so he had to do with what he had to do, and that's part of the history of the game. And we have a lot of 19th century players who are in the Hall of Fame. And I mean,
Yeah.
technically we consider that major league, but in the 19th century, I think the pitcher's mound was shorter and the way the game was played. I mean, you could make the argument like, why are these guys in the Hall of Fame? The way they're playing was totally different, which is why you get players with 40 something wins and 800 innings pitched in a season or something back then. It's like, well, these guys weren't throwing 98 miles an hour, they were just kind of batting practice pitching, and the ball was scuffed and it was and the ball was dead, so he couldn't hit it very far anyway. So but that's all part of the history and lore of the game.
And
Um,
that's why it's important for that stuff to be, in the Hall of Fame, in the museum, because you're telling the story of baseball, and that's part of the story, Like, sure, I mean, maybe Cap Anson or whatever wouldn't have been able to make a career now, but I mean, the majority of the stuff that goes on now. Can you imagine, like, if you were a 19th century player and all of a sudden you show up in 2015 or whatever, and you're in the box and someone is throwing 101 miles an hour?
yeah, yeah. It's funny because there's a lot of this debate on the internet about this player couldn't play in this era, blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, send a modern player back to the 20s or the teens
Oh my
before
God.
penicillin, when a ear infection would kill you, and
Right.
no modern medicine. And there was a story, the socks, how they called it like the blood sock. The reason they wore the stirrups is because the dye in the socks was
Right.
poisonous, and if you cut yourself, like you would die. So they had to
Yeah.
wear like the white sanitary sock to keep the blood from getting in your cut. And like, try playing in that era, guys
Yeah.
who are, you know,
But that's a really good point that you bring up, though. I mean,
yeah,
it's you have to think of it in those terms. I think at least you have to think of it in those terms.
yeah,
Obviously, a lot of other people don't necessarily think that, but whatever.
yeah. Well, Greg, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but this kind of a good way to finish it off, talking about making baseball come alive. You certainly make baseball come alive. We've gone a few minutes past. I just have one or two questions for you before we wrap up.
Sure.
With the research, as we're talking about the Baseball Hall of Fame, do you work with the Baseball Hall of Fame? Do you ever reach out to them, to the research department, anything like that, to help get stats or information for your paintings?
I do sometimes. I have a little bit of a relationship with Tom Schieber, who works there, and he helps me out sometimes, just in terms of like some of the artifacts that they have that aren't necessarily on display. Uh, Interestingly enough, the Hall of Fame, they they know a lot and they have a lot, and it's like a very kind of general knowledge base in a sense. So like when it comes to like imagery or like weird minutia, they're not really the people that I go to. Usually that will be a writer, someone who might have, written the book on whatever player, or more often than not, I'm going to collectors, people, people in the memorabilia and card industry. I think that's probably where the majority of my clients come from. But I guess maybe it's less so these days. But yeah, those people have been like so helpful, and it's like I've kind of developed relationships with those folks like over the past I don't know 20 years at this point. And it, you know stuff like still every day, I'm like learning about something completely new that'll surprise me, something that's been like long dormant in somebody's files, whether they did like a screen grab of like uh this Mexican League uniform that I've never seen, but it has like the color scheme that I'm looking for or whatever. Um, I feel like those folks are usually more helpful than, say, the Hall of Fame, but not saying that the Hall of Fame is not helpful.
And finally, I want to ask if people are interested in your work, where can they get more information?
Well, I mean, as long as you can spell my name right or kind of right, you can probably find me. I'm on pretty much all of the social media platforms, whether it's Twitter or X or whatever it's called, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram. And yeah, it's usually just under Greg Kreindler, just my name, Graig Kreindler. And yeah, like I said, if you can spell my name, you can find me pretty easily.
Cool. In the post edit, I'll drop the links and everything. For our listeners, I'm on graigkreinder.com. I want to ask you if I'm looking at your paintings.
Yeah.
So these are beautiful. Are they available for sale? Are the originals available? Do you make prints of the originals? How does that work? If someone wanted to buy one of these, put in their office, in their home, how does one do that?
So they basically the only way is to reach out to me, but uh I do have an inventory of some work that's finished that is available, but the majority of the stuff on my website is sold. I don't typically do prints that often, though I did a line of giclées. Giclée is like a very high-end art print. I did a line of giclées not last year, but the year before, and I'm going to be doing one in a couple of months with a Satchel Paige painting that I just finished up. And I'm trying to make that more of a, semi-regular, I guess as regular as I can be, thing. I'm trying to maybe do it like once a year, or at least once every other year, just so it gives folks, I guess, more of an opportunity to own stuff at like at a lower price point.
Sure, sure.
Uh, but
There's
yeah,
there.
the majority is just originals.
So it sounds like it's fair to say, I'll get into a little supply demand here lesson. So if you've got an original Greg out there, they're kind of one of a kind. Do you work on a kind of commission base? Like people reach out to say, hey, can you paint this player, and that's usually how it works.
Yeah, yeah. Usually they contact me, and more often than not, they'll just have the name. It's kind of like I want a Yogi Berra painting or I want a Hank Aaron painting, and then we kind of work together, uh, trying to find imagery that vibes with them and vibes with me. And we'll decide on something and we'll do the painting. Uh, every now and then, and it's very, very, very rare, the person will give me carte blanche and they'll just say, do whatever the heck you want, which is awesome. Um, and sometimes they have like the player and the actual image in mind and they'll contact me and they'll want that. It's kind of all over the place. But yeah, it's pretty much all commission based. And, I even when I do other work that's kind of on spec, they say, stuff that's not for anyone specifically. A lot of times, I might post it on social and someone would be like, "Hey, is that available? I love how it's coming out or whatever." And like, "Yeah, sure." And then they'll be like, "All right, I'll take it whenever it's done." And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I can't believe it happens. I still think, you know, I'm really lucky and also think that these people might be crazy, but that's okay.
It's
I
it's
do
tough.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's tough to make it to make art and music. You know, you're living. I think I mentioned I've had Chuck Brodsky, I've had Dan Byrne on, singer songwriters, musicians. It's a tough go of things to decide at at a young age I'm going to make art or music. My life. I wish I'm an attorney by day, but kind of got forced in, not necessarily forced, but if I had my ways, I'd make music or and talk baseball, full time. Maybe one day I'll still do that.
Well,
But
yeah, maybe you just need to put, more of the energy into that, and
yeah,
then you can like make a slow transition.
yeah, that's
I
the
mean,
plan.
that's how it happens, right?
Yeah, so I'm a little envious of people that can make their passion their life in terms of the business. So I'm happy for you, good for you,
Thank
and for all of our fans and listeners out there, if you are looking for that perfect piece to tie the room together, as the dude says in the Big Lebowski, that oil painting and beautiful oil, if you've got an office, your man cave, your baseball watching place, reach out to Greg. The paintings, you can go on his website. They're absolutely beautiful. And I can only imagine in person on the actual canvas, seeing the oil, they've got to be amazing. But certainly the piece de resistance you're going to need in your office there or baseball room. No room is complete without it. So reach out to Greg, get one of those. Greg, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I just want to give you the chance of trying to plug you a little bit. Any final thoughts or anything you want to get in here? Well, before we get off here.
No, I mean, I really appreciate you having me on and mentioning the dude. I just want somebody to say, that painting really tied the room together. That would be ideal.
Yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. Well, Greg, thanks. I'm gonna hit the end record button and we can chat for 2 seconds off the record and I'll let you go.
Sure.
All right, thanks,
Thanks,
Greg.
Russell.